Welcome back to My Business Academia. Today I'm joined by Anish Kaushal. Anish is a graduate from med school in Scotland, and he's currently working as a healthcare venture capitalist at Amplitude Ventures here in Toronto. Anish, thanks for joining me. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for asking me to join this. This is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on today. So let's just jump right into it. I mentioned you're a med school graduate, so let's start there because I think that's one of the main things that sets you apart from other people in the VC space. How did you get involved in med school? Like, when did you decide maybe you wanted to pursue the medical path?
Yeah, so I think it was something that I kind of always thought I was going to do as a kid. I mean, I think, when you're living in a Brown family, there's a couple options for you as a child, and you tend to kind of go where your parents kind of direct you. And so I did well at science and math at school, and so I thought that was like, stereotypical path as to what I wanted to do. And generally like thought I wanted to be a doctor sort of grown up, but then got to end of high school and started taking accounting economics. I really enjoyed those aspects of it and thought, okay, like, should I apply to business schools? Should I apply to like regular commerce programs? And so when I applied to university, I applied to like all the business schools as well as all the like science programs and med programs. And I was just very fortunate that I got an opportunity and I got accepted to study it in Scotland, as you mentioned. And it was a direct entry program right out of high school. I was 16 years old at the time. I didn't have to take the risk of also doing the MCAT and doing undergrad in Canada, where I'm sure you and I both know how difficult it can be, and how many interviews you have to go through, and how much time and years it can take. And so I essentially avoided that and sort of went direct, knowing that I would probably have difficulty getting back to Canada sort of later on as a resident, but that it was okay to do that because, if you could study abroad for 6 years in Scotland, get an MD by the end of it, you can kind of figure it out after that. So yeah, that was sort of push and reason why I kind of got involved and wanted to do it sort of at the B or when I went out of high school. And then yeah, can kind of if you want get into like how I decided to switch and whatnot. But yeah, it was something I always thought I was going to do as a kid for sure.
Did it meet your expectations, like the school side of things? Was it what you expected to get out of med school, or was it a little different than what you expected?
Yeah, it was definitely I mean from a personal perspective it far exceeded anything I thought. I mean, it was the greatest experience of my life and would recommend to anybody like if you had the ability to go abroad to study in particular, like take it every single time and don't think about it. So that in itself was incredible and I really enjoyed that. The actual school itself was, when you first get in, I think we all kind of have this imposter syndrome, or at least I definitely did when I got there because I was a 17-year-old kid. I was coming from Canada. I was studying with all these people in the UK who were like, top 5% in their class, and thinking, oh shit, okay, I got to compete with all these guys and figure it out. And, over time, you eventually find your own way and you figure out like how to study and what you need to know and not need to know. And I tried to stick with the routine as much as possible. And so yeah, from an academic perspective, it was totally fine. And then it was more, I think, for me towards the end when I got to my clinical years, the job itself was a job. So like, I got to hospital, I got to clinic, I did my stuff, but I never really enjoyed it. I never loved it. It was just like something I did because I was in med school and that's what you do. But it was like I never really enjoyed like getting up, going to class, like going to the hospital. Like sometimes you have interactions with patients that like were, pretty gratifying. But by and large, like I was like, it's fine, but it's not, not the be all end all. And so, when I ended up leaving, I was very fortunate that I found something I really enjoyed. But yeah, it was in terms of expectations, it was I think like from a personal side far exceeded, and then professionally from an academic side, pretty much I think standard what you would think.
Awesome. I think a common theme, just kind of tying med school together with like maybe people who are in the MBA program, a common theme that probably comes up between students is being pressed for time all day, every day, no matter what you're doing. So between like your like coursework, your clinicals, things outside of school, did you have like similar experiences being pressed for time always? And how did you deal with that?
Yeah, I definitely did. I think trying to figure out how to balance it as much as possible. I think also routine was super important to me. So like I was very consistent when I was in school and I was in lectures. It was like I come home, first thing I do, I basically eat and like immediately like write notes on whatever lectures I had during the day. Because the way I studied was like I typed all my notes at the time, and then when studying came around, I just revisited them over and over again. So I didn't have to make new notes. And so it was more just like a consistent practice of like doing things kind of every day, which was ended up saving me a lot of time on the back end because, when studying came around and we had those 2 weeks, like I saw tons of friends who were stressed, cramming, pulling all-nighters, like, couldn't do it. And I was like, kind of chilling, if that makes sense. Like I wasn't studying crazy hours. Like I just basically read my notes and I'd already, because I'd done them already and basically gone to revisit them. I was just basically like rejogging the memory of like what I had already seen. And so that for me was very useful. But yeah, in terms of time, like I think it was also a priority where like I would prioritize like stuff outside of class just as much as class. Like, spending time with friends, going out, like having fun, trying different clubs, activities, sports, like those I think are actually as important, if not more important, than your actual academics. And I think particularly from an MBA perspective, right? Like, by and large, most of the content that you guys can learn, like, you can find it online. It's not really difficult. There's tons of people on YouTube and Google and like, tons of courses you can get for free that basically will teach you the same thing. But I think the people that you meet and the skills that you develop, the soft skills in particular, that you get when you're outside in, outside of lectures and you're partying or you're going out or you're part of clubs or, you're doing activities like that kind of stuff is what I think is the value, more so, at least for me, it was, than the actual academics itself.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned routines. I'm kind of curious. Do you have any daily routines or morning routines that you follow these days?
Um, Daily, well, morning, not, I'm not a morning person. So, morning, I would not ask me that because I really don't like mornings. Getting up is not the best. I mean, like morning wise, is just like usually get up, have a tea, like sit there, like, we all do it, look at our phone for 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and then start working. I think my nighttime is probably more like specific in that, like, every night it's like do my brush, journal, and then meditate and go to bed. And like I've tried to do that as consistently as possible for the last 4 years. And noticed significant changes to me just as an individual, but also what I've learned and what I've been able to think about. So, that habit I think is something that I'm, like very particular on and like try to stick with. But yeah, morning wise, I am not a morning person, so I would not ask you
Yeah,
about
me
that.
neither. So, I'm always asking people what their morning routines are, trying to add new things to my routine, maybe eventually become a morning person. But so
Yeah,
far, so
exactly.
far,
That's the
I'll
goal,
stick.
right? Yeah.
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 So after you graduated from your from the MD program there in Scotland, you went to Amsterdam and you joined M
Mhm.
Ventures as an analyst. How did you get involved there?
Yeah, so a lot of it was I would say a lot of luck. I mean, luck and timing, I would have to say most of it. Obviously, some people have said to me, yeah, you still have to work hard, you still have to do your thing. But, it just so happened that a lot of things worked out really well. So, basically the thing that happened to me was that, I was graduating school and I, had it like I was finishing med school at the time. I didn't really want to do residency, but I kind of applied and didn't end up getting in. So I had to take a year out anyway. And at the time, my idea was to go back to school to get a master's degree in London. So it was a 1 year master's that was in, drug discovery and pharma management. So it was about like, the pharma industry, how it works. Like, and I had a friend who had taken that degree, and got a job out of it. And so I was like, okay, like, it's just pretty good. And she basically said, hey, because you're an already MD, if you come in, like getting a job out of it's pretty simple. And I said, okay, that's pretty good. So like I applied and that program didn't start basically till end of September. And so I graduated end of June, end of September. So you have like 3, 4 months basically off. And so what I did at that time was I basically just started talking to people, just having chats, like coffee chats, reaching out, cold emailing, everything. And I also applied to a ton of jobs. So like applied to a banking job, got a flight out interview in New York. I didn't get in. I got a consulting job, final interview, in London, didn't get in. And then I applied to a bunch of other industry jobs and, every time rejection, rejection, rejection. So I said, okay, no problem, all good. And then my dad actually was like, hey, have you heard of this thing called venture capital? And I, being a doctor and not being in tech or business or anything like that, I didn't really know about it. Like my understanding of it was around the show called Silicon Valley, which is, about tech and, raising money and, Facebook, Twitter, and Uber and stuff. And so that's what I thought. I was just like, oh, it's very specific to tech. He was like, no, no, it's like healthcare. There's a bunch of stuff in healthcare as well. And I said, okay, that's pretty interesting and different. So what I did was I basically just cold emailed like 75 people around the world. I like looked up on Google. I was like, who are the biggest healthcare venture firms? Looked at their people, see if I could find an email, and just basically sent an email. And as you can imagine, a lot of people don't respond, but a couple people did and wrote me emails. Some people got on the phone with me, and then M Ventures came calling and said, hey, like by the way, we saw your application. We actually have this internship program. Are you interested? And at this point in time, you have to remember, like, I'd been probably rejected from 40 jobs. And so I was like, yeah, okay, of course I'm interested. But, like, whatever, I'll go through the process and, I'm going to end up in London doing my master's degree anyway. And so I went through, and at the time, what's also crazy is that the program was not advertised. So I didn't even know it existed and was basically like a shot in the dark kind of thing. So they're like, yeah, we have an opening on our therapeutics team, like, come through for an interview. So I did 3 rounds of interviews, with them. And then eventually, like basically 2 days before I was about to move to London, they said, yeah, we really like you. We'll see you in Amsterdam. And so my life basically switched on its head. And 2 weeks later, I was on a flight to the Netherlands. So, yeah, yeah, pretty kind of crazy story. I look back on it, I can't believe it kind of happened that way. But yeah, that's basically how I got involved with them.
So is M Ventures like based around healthcare? They're like a healthcare VC firm.
Yeah, exactly. So M Ventures is Merck's corporate venture firm. So Merck
Okay.
is actually divided into Merck, like what people know in the US, and then also what's called EMD Serono, which is known in the US, but then in Germany it's called Merck KGaA. And so their venture firm is sort of split into four different sort of verticals. So life sciences was one, healthcare was one, like therapeutics was one, new businesses was one, um, and then what was the other one? There's one more I'm forgetting, but basically, yeah. So basically their therapeutics team was the largest team, and they spent a lot of time mostly related to, because it was a corporate VC, it was related to the indications and areas that the corporate pharma company was looking at. So spent a lot of time working in oncology. That was like a huge part of it, and then a little bit of time in immunology and women's health as well.
Cool, cool. So now you're still a healthcare VC analyst here, but now you're working at Amplitude Ventures. Um,
Mhm.
when it comes to like healthcare VC, you probably had a lot of background on the healthcare side of things. Did you have to like learn a lot of information regarding like the more VC side of things, or did that just come naturally along with the job?
A little bit of both. I mean, a lot of it was definitely like the first. I would say, like, the way I would describe it was my M Ventures experience was probably like my mini MBA, almost introduction to venture, because like you learn a lot on the job, but like it's very different and different than anything I would have done. Like, there's no, it's not like I had prep. I didn't do any business courses. I didn't know what venture was. Like, I was basically going in blind, and I think they kind of liked that because then they could train you and sort of teach you the way they wanted, and I was very grateful for that. And so yeah, a lot of it was, doing like learning basic science, learning how to do research, learning how to present, and also understanding a little bit about companies, portfolio companies, how do you raise money, what are pre and post money valuations, like all of the, like how much money are you raising, what's your budget, milestones, like all of these things that you kind of think about. And so I learned that. I was very fortunate to learn that sort of during that 6 months, but obviously I was supplementing that, right? So I think that the thing I really appreciate about venture is like you kind of get to touch on a lot of different things. Like you have to be kind of a mini expert on many things. So you have to learn about a lot. And I think in order to thrive in venture, like you have to have a lot of interest. You have to be willing to read and go very broad and like in terms of scope, because like you have to be on it, or even if you're not on it, at least know how to find the answer very quickly. And so yeah, that a lot of it was like at the beginning it was like a bit of a, definitely a bit of a jump, but over time like you eventually learn and figure out sort of the lingo and what everybody's saying after a little while.
Yeah, I like that kind of like continuous learning that's always going on. That's awesome to hear.
Mhm.
So what kind of tasks do you do like on a day to day basis at Amplitude?
So every day is different, which I really like, and it's not for everyone, but it is. I do appreciate that. So there's a lot of different. It depends on what. The other thing I would say is it really depends on the firm itself. So, like for example, my job in Amsterdam, it was a firm that was set up for 10 years. It was running an internship program. You come in, you have a very specific role. It's like look at companies, assess companies. That's kind of all you do. So you don't think about operations and back office and finance and branding and media and all of these other things. And then when I joined Amplitude, it was I joined as one of the first employees with sort of the founders and a couple of people that joined, and now we're I think almost double where we were started. And so we had to set up all these things. So I had to set up the deal flow system. We had to set up our CRM process, like set up data rooms, like help with presentations. And now my role, I think, is a lot. It's kind of it is multifaceted in the sense of like I do some operation stuff, like I help presentations and data rooms and help with fundraising and organizing our CRM system. I do a little bit of media and branding. So like Amplitude, for example, has a blog, and those are all posts that I've done and I've written myself. And also obviously help with diligence and when we're learning new investments or like helping to think about how we, what kinds of questions we need to know, talking to CEOs, taking calls, um, showing up at events and, networking with other co-investors. So like it's very different. I wouldn't say like very day to day. It's like always the same. But I think in order to thrive in the role, what I've realized is like you definitely need a very broad skill set in the sense that like you have to be able and be comfortable with also doing many things. And the other thing is also not having somebody on top of you telling you what to do, because obviously you get assigned tasks and you work within a team, but it's ventures are very can be a very lonely business in the sense that it's very small teams. You're on your own a lot. You have to be very self-motivated to continue to work on your stuff and do what you do and also push your own learning, because like nobody's really around. It's like all the time, especially in this remote working world. And so that's just for me personally, I enjoy it because like I'm happy to be on my own and do my own thing, but I know it's not for everyone. So yeah, but in terms of day to day, that's kind of some of the things I kind of do every day.
Okay, so you mentioned that's one of the things that you do enjoy. Is there anything that like what has been like the biggest challenge for you in the VC space?
I think the biggest challenge is a lot of it, I would say, is like just the remote work and the motivation to continue. And I think this is a problem for everyone. I don't know if this is a venture specific problem, but like the last 2 years, I mean, my our team is very small and very spread out. So like we're 12 people across Canada, and we have 2 people in Toronto, including myself. It's not very big teams. And also like when I think a lot of people, especially when they leave MBA or they leave like university, where like if they get into their original job, there's a lot of people around them or some people around them that are the same age or like similar in terms of career and where they are and what they're doing. And venture is not like that in the sense that like a lot of people are very senior. They've like built businesses or done different things and then come back. And so I think for me, like that idea of like staying motivated and continuing to like go through it was definitely a challenge, and definitely part of it that it's a grind. Like some days you can't get up and you're like very motivated, and others you're like I do not want to do anything today, and that's what it is. So like again, I don't know if that's a venture specific thing, but I've noticed like for me the last few years trying to balance the idea of work and like continuing to do well in like in doing on the venture side, but also like personally like figuring out, okay, what do you have outside of this, what do you have outside of your job, because like respectfully, you can work till you die, and that's a pretty lonely and miserable life in my opinion. And so you have to figure out how do you balance. And so that was for me a very like I'm very conscious and aware of that, of like the balance aspect of the job, because it is tough and it's a grind and it doesn't really stop. So but yeah, I would say that kind of the social aspect and like the sort of being on your own aspect is one that can be difficult for sure.
Yeah, and I like that it kind of ties back into what you mentioned earlier about like still placing importance on things outside of your school or outside of your work, to help keep that balance. That's awesome. And then you also mentioned like you did reach out to a lot of different VC firms, a lot of different people. You did some networking. Is that the best way that you would recommend for people to get involved in the VC space, or is there any other advice you have for those who are interested in either learning more about VC or want to maybe start a career in VC?
Yeah, so I think there's many paths, and I think everybody you ask will give you a different answer, and a lot of it will be the answer that they had on their path. And so I could technically be the same, but I think there are many ways to get into VC, right? So one, you do the traditional like banking consulting route, you go work there for a couple of years, and then you figure out how to switch into venture. One is you start your own startup, and so you figure out and you raise money, and you kind of do it. Another is like join like an incubator, accelerator, a tech transfer office, like join one of those, work at that for a couple of years. What I did, I wouldn't say is common, like cold emailing a bunch of VCs and getting a job, especially in healthcare right off the bat, is not the most common thing. But at the same time, I think the other thing I did notice was that if you do take initiative and start to reach out to people and and continue and be resilient and not like sort of stop, eventually some people realize that they know your name. Because the other thing I think the thing I realized with venture is a very small community. It's very tight, and like once you're kind of in, it's like easier. It is a bit easier to kind of network around, but also a lot of venture groups know each other, right? And so if you hear of a person that's like constantly reaching out, constantly having chats, like and over time, like not like in a week, but like a month, 2 months, 3 months, then people start to take notice. Like, okay, like this guy or this girl has like initiative. She's willing to talk, she's willing to chat, and then obviously it's up to you to decide like what you want out of it. So I mean, I think the networking thing is definitely important. I wouldn't say that it's not. Um, I think reaching out to people. I think the other thing is just realizing like don't take rejection personally. It's never personal. If people don't want to talk to you and they don't say anything, all good. Don't waste your time. Move on. Like I you have to be comfortable. Like I mean, I got rejected 100 times before I got a job, so like that's just how it works. And I think that's the thing that I think people need to realize and understand is like all you need is one opportunity and one person to take a chance on you. But if you limit yourself and only reach out to 3, 5, 10 people, you're really limiting your base. Versus if you reach out to 100, chances are one might say, yeah, like I'll take a chance on you. And so, yeah, I mean, I think, again, to your point of like, how do you get involved? There's many different ways to do it. I wouldn't say there's one. And I think it's just finding out what you like, what you want to go to, what you're interested in, and really pursuing that more than just, oh, I want to be in venture capital.
Awesome. So you have like multiple years of experience now in VC. Is there a highlight of your career that you have so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that was interesting was also, so one of our companies went public a few years ago, and being a part of that process and like seeing it go, and like the IPO process and presentations and what we had to do on our side, and getting everything ready. That was pretty cool. I think for me personally was one deal that I worked on that hopefully should come out. Well, we're gonna find out a result probably early next year, which is a company called Prolenia. So it's a company in the neurodegenerative space that's developing a late stage clinical asset in Huntington's disease. So it's a very rare neurological condition. There's no treatment, and it's essentially a genetic condition where it's basically a death sentence. So you basically live the first 30 to 40 years of your life completely normal, and then you basically deteriorate for the next 20 into death eventually, which is really sad. And also there's nothing to stop it, and there's nothing to halt it. And so I did work on, because I was on my clinical background, like into this company that had this asset that was in Huntington's disease, and they found that in a very specific patient population in Huntington's, they could really potentially slow down the progress of this disease. And so to me, that became super interesting because on the clinical side, like that's why I joined venture, to make that sort of broader impact rather than just investing in early stage science. And so if touch wood, we'll see, it comes out in a couple of months. We'll see if it works or not. But if it does, like that's a product that like could really save a lot of people's lives and time, and give families all this more time with their loved ones, that they're not deteriorating much more than they did. And that was one that I spent a lot of time on. Like I was our lead diligence person. I put together our investment memo. Like I was talking with our partner, but it was also amazing to see, because there was one conversation where it was me, my partner, so one of my bosses, and the CEO. And the CEO said to us like, "Hey, we want you guys," because it was a very hot deal at the time. We weren't sure if we were going to get in. And they're like, "Hey, we just want to say, like, we really want you guys involved, because the work that you guys put in, particularly you, Anish, and the questions that you asked were some of the best that we've ever seen." And I was like, "Wow, okay, that's pretty cool." And to say that in front of my boss as well, and then my boss kind of told the rest of the team and kind of said the same thing. That was to me like a very career highlight. Whereas like, okay, because I think for a long time in venture, you think you're an imposter, and that never goes away. But I think to see people like that, like especially people that are very well respected, like this is a guy who he discovered the Huntington's genes in the 80s, and he's run multiple biotech companies in his life. And, he's like much later stage in his career. And the fact that he could say that about me, like as a junior, was enough for me to be like, okay, I think I'm doing the right thing at least, which is good. So yeah, I would say that was probably a big one for sure.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's an amazing story to hear. Firstly, like being able to work on projects that have a large scale impact on the world, and then also getting that recognition. That's awesome to hear. Like you can
Mhm.
finally see that your hard work's been paid off. That's great. So we mentioned a little bit. We mentioned one side of things where you have a bit of a medical background and you're working in healthcare VC. For those who have no like medical background at all, but have the business side of things that are working in healthcare VC, like I'm sure a lot of your coworkers have like CFAs or
Mhm.
CPAs, that kind of experience. Is there much of a learning curve for them that you've seen where they have to like start learning constantly new information as well about ongoing healthcare trends and issues in the space?
Yes, absolutely. Especially if on the investment side. So I think, like, for example, we have CFAs and CPAs and accountants and whatnot that are on the finance and operations side. And so for them, like, it's a little more straightforward, it's more, what you kind of learn in school. But if you're on the investment side, I would say that in healthcare VC, at least what we do in biotech, it's very difficult to get in if you just have a business background. So if you have no science background, respectfully, like, good luck, because like it's almost next to impossible if you're trying to get into the healthcare side, unless you start a startup, or unless you like work at a healthcare organization, or work in pharma for like 10 years, or work at a biotech, like, because I think the difference is like the lingo and language is completely different. And so if you've grown up your entire career in one industry and one set of language and one set of lingo, and then you go to the other one with no background, it's super tough, especially when you're like working in it. I think it's different if you're taking a degree and taking some course on the side, or doing a diploma or something like that. That's fine. But if you're working in it, I think that's a completely different thing. So I mean, I would say like like if you're a finance person trying to get in, the best thing you can do is like you need to read a ton, like, and I mean like a shit ton, because you have to basically catch up with all these people who have background in exactly what you don't have, and you have to learn it very quickly. And I think that was like, I remember talking to one of my colleagues who she joined us as an analyst a few years ago. She was a PhD, super smart, very driven, very hardworking. Not much business background, worked in a little bit in business, but not a huge amount. And she said like the biggest part for her was like catching up to speed with like every concept and what was going on. And that's why, like, for me, I feel very fortunate, because on the clinical side, like if you give me a disease, I immediately have an idea what it is, how it's treated, who's how is it diagnosed, like who is talking to. Versus if you don't have that, trying to learn all of that and then have an opinion that's educated about what you're doing, but also ask informed questions, can be difficult. So I would say like it's, again, not impossible, but you definitely have to be reading and like up to date a lot for sure.
Yeah, I remember like I listened to your podcast episode with your dad, and he mentioned something similar where it's easier to go from like a science undergrad into business than like a
Yeah.
business undergrad into science. So hearing like both sides of the equation and seeing like the pros and cons of either one is kind of interesting to hear.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've heard a lot about your experience in VC and some of your education background. Before we finish things up, I wanted to kind of touch on some of your personal interests. So you've mentioned that you have a sports obsession, you're a frequent traveler, you love to read, love to write. So I wanted to ask you some quick fire questions. You don't need to provide too much detail about them. We'll just have some fun before we end off
Cool.
today's episode.
Sounds good.
So it says you've mentioned 50 or you visited 55 countries by the age of 21. Do you
Mhm.
have a favorite country that you visited
Country,
or city
not
or
really.
place?
City. I mean, I love London. I've been
Yeah.
to London like probably over 10 times. Like it's my favorite place in the world. That or Hawaii. I mean, those two I would say like are the two places that like just incredible, have a great time, always good, like know what's going on, very comfortable.
They seem
So
like
yeah.
polar opposites looking
Yeah,
from the
they
outside.
they definitely are. They're on opposite sides of the world too. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Is there somewhere that you've been looking forward to go but haven't had the chance to go yet?
I really want to go to Japan and Korea, like especially Japan, like particularly for their food. I love food. I especially more that I've gotten older, like much more appreciative of like really good food, and like Japan just feels like a mecca of that. So yeah, eventually one day I'll be out there.
One day.
Yeah.
Another thing, so you've read a lot of books. You have some of them listed on your website,
Mhm.
anishexperience.com. If you have them kind of split up into different categories, one of the categories is like business. Do you have a
Yeah.
recommendation for maybe one book for business and then another book that's outside of business?
So the first one in business that comes to mind is a book called Richer, Wiser, Happier by this guy called William Green. So it was a book that came out a year or two ago. And basically what he does, he's like this older reporter, used to work for like I think the Times and Forbes. And he basically just interviewed like the best investors of the last sort of 20, 30 years and people that you've a lot of never heard of. And he basically just like had time where he sat with them for sometimes weeks. And he was there talking to them and he basically like tried to distill all of their insights into like what made them great investors as individuals, and also how they were all different and similar, right? So like a lot of them had this sort of value investing thesis of like buy companies for less than they're worth and just kind of wait and see where they go. But they also all had like very different ways to make money and ways to assess businesses and ways to do things. So I really like that, would just because like it gave you insight into the people behind the investing, because obviously we all know who Buffett is and everybody talks about that and that's great, but like these guys are ones who have generated serious returns over many, many, many decades, who are much more unknown. And so that I think was kind of cool. And then, sorry, the other question was one other one in which other category?
Yeah, maybe another book that's outside of the business category.
Outside the business category. I've learned to love biographies a lot, and I think two that I really loved recently that I read was one was Matthew McConaughey's called Green Lights. That was actually really cool, just because his story is really awesome, and the way he writes is very like he makes you feel a lot, and he makes you like put you in the situation. And then the other one was the Will Smith biography. So it's called Will. I know people aren't the biggest fans of him these days based on what he did at the Oscars, but his life story and backstory, like it starts out very like he starts out very cocky and like I mean crazy story, because so people don't know this, but he was the first rapper to ever win a Grammy, with him and Jazzy Jeff, which is kind of wild if you think about it, all the way back in those days. And now obviously he's become one of the biggest movie stars in the world. But it's amazing because the story arc goes through like the peak of his career and also the fall and even now into where he is today, but also like what he's kind of learned throughout it. And so that one was just like as you read it, you're like, oh my god, there's so much to take away and learn from. So yeah, I would say those two in terms of biographies are really, really good books for sure.
Yeah, I'll have to check all three of those books out. So let's move on to sports. The World Cup's going on right now. Do you have any predictions on who's winning this year?
I mean, I'm British, half British, so I have to say England because that's what I
It's
have
coming
to do,
home.
and it's coming home for sure. But no, I mean, I mean, I would have said Argentina, and obviously they lost today against Saudi, so
Yeah.
not the best. Brazil is still up there for sure. I don't know if France will get there because Benzema's now out, Pogba's out, Kante's out, so like that's going to be tough for them to get through. People always like Belgium. Yeah, I don't know. I would say like Brazil or England to me, like they feel like I would like to see one of them win for sure.
Yeah, I was thinking Argentina as well, but I don't know after today, so maybe
Yeah.
Brazil. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
What about for the Premier League? Who do you think's winning this year? And also, who do you support?
So I'm a big Liverpool supporter. My family's from there, so have been for many, many years. It's let's say a tough year, considering the last few years for us. In terms of who's winning, like Arsenal is there, which is kind of
Mm-hmm.
shocking that it's still going on. I mean, everybody would say City because just the depth. And Arsenal, I think, will have. I mean, they're going to be tighter going into next year with like the crunch of games, and do they have the squad to like actually compete if they want to do Europa and the top? But if they decide to focus on the Premier League and are still going strong, like it can be really interesting. So yeah, I mean those two right now seem like the consensus. Like yeah, one of them I think will probably take it.
Yeah, definitely seems like that. So you watch both footballs. So how about the other football? Any predictions for
Yeah,
the Super Bowl?
I mean, I'm a Ravens guy, so obviously I'm always going to root for Lamar. I think our problem is we don't have any receivers, and that's always been our issue. And Lamar, it's like always shaky because in the playoffs, like things change. I mean, like on the one side of the ball, like the AFC, I mean, KC looks like the best, but then also like they lose to Indianapolis early in the year, and you're like, okay, well, this doesn't make any sense. And then on the NFC side, like, I mean, to be on, I mean, the Eagles, you'd have to say the Eagles are Cowboys, like look like on that side, but yeah, I don't know. I think I love this year because football is so much parity and like every week anybody can win, and like there have been massive 10-point underdogs plus who have won games outright this year. So like yeah, anything can happen, but yeah, obviously I'm rooting for the Ravens, and let's see how far they go.
And last sport, how about for the NBA Finals? Any predictions?
I love the Bucks. I've always loved the Bucks. I think the Bucks would have won the last few years if Chris Middleton didn't get injured. I think they would have crushed Boston. I mean, the fact they went to Game 7, like without Middleton, is something in itself. Middleton's not even back yet, and the Bucks are still like the first or second seed. So like to me, it's Milwaukee and then everybody else. Golden State, I mean, they're I think fallen off a lot. Utah, I don't think sustains itself. Um, the Clippers have kind of not been there. I mean, honestly, the West is, I think, pretty open. Like, I don't know if there's one consensus. And then the East, like, I think it's, yeah, Milwaukee and then Boston, people would say. And then I think, yeah, everybody else kind of behind them.
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to look back on this and see how well this aged.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I know I could be completely wrong or maybe a little bit right. We'll find out.
Yeah, awesome. Do you have any advice before we finish up today? Maybe something that's either stuck with you or just advice that you'd rather like want to share.
Yeah, I think two things. One, it was just enjoy the process. I think a lot of times is whenever we start something, and especially as you're going through your MBA school, it's all about like getting the job and your career and setting everything up and making sure. I think a lot of times we just forget to enjoy where we are and what we're doing right now and what's going on. And I've been super guilty of that my whole life because we're trained in brown households where everything is the next thing and your happiness is always delayed until you accomplish what you want to accomplish. But I think like prioritizing and like actually enjoying where you are today, I think is super important. And I think the other thing is just like, I think listen more, like listen and ask better questions. Cause I think a lot of answers that you have, or things that you're thinking about, like people have done it before, people have answered it before, but also you can get a lot more out of interactions if you ask sort of questions that people don't think about. And so those two, I would say, like, are ones that, at least for me, I try to remind myself of as much as I can.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's good advice to keep in mind moving on or moving forward rather. So while we're finishing up here, what's next for you? You've mentioned on your website from things from starting a personal fund in the future, writing books. You've had a podcast in the past. I think you've mentioned you might be bringing it back. Who knows?
Yeah.
Do you have any personal projects that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Obviously, the work side is touchwood going pretty well. I've been doing it for a little while, enjoying it so far. I think the next year or so, spending a lot more time on the personal side of things. So I'm actually going to run a marathon next year, which I'm not a runner, so that's one that is on my plate. And then to your point on the podcast, so I've been writing a lot for the last few years. Really started to get more serious about it at the beginning of 2021, and since that time, I have about close to 850 blog posts and book notes and things that I've written. And so the goal is to eventually turn every single one of those into a podcast episode. And so I think that journey will start basically end of this year, early next year. And sort of, it's going to be a long road, but very excited and looking forward to it. And so, yeah, that's, I think where the priorities kind of lie is like, putting podcasts out there, putting content out there. Like, I think I've just been very fortunate to live a really interesting and different life that I know a lot of people, I feel like trying to teach some of what I wish I knew when I was younger, regarding whether it's books or experiences or career or whatnot. And so the goal is to just share what I've done. So yeah, that's kind of the next step, and we'll see how it goes. Should be fun.
Yeah, best of luck on the marathon, the training that's going to be involved, and I'm looking forward to all the content creation that's hopefully coming out soon.
Mhm.
So for those who are interested in learning more about you or maybe want to get in touch, where can they reach you?
Yeah, so my website is probably the best in terms of to get understanding of who I am. So like a niche experience. So a niche Niche, and then experience. is probably the way to do it. I'm sure you probably add in the show notes, whatever. So that probably has everything you need to know. Like, yeah, I mean, there's like, if you want to find some of my writing, it's all on the website, but I also have a Medium as well. And then Twitter is the same. It's probably the best way to sort of find me there as well. So Anish Experiences on that. And then my personal one is, it's called Anish K Bio. So yeah, that's probably where to, but I think the website's probably the best way, and then people can kind of figure it out from there.
Yeah, the website's awesome. It's got a great blend of like resources on where to find information, and then also like your blog posts between business side of things and personal side of things. So it's awesome.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Aman.